So we've talked a lot in this course about efficient markets and the conditions necessary for efficient markets. We've talked about the ways that executives and business leaders can cause distortions in those markets to create supernormal profits. We've talked about how some of those distortions are perfectly good and legitimate. Innovating and getting a monopoly, getting a patent is great. Many of those distortions are immoral and illegal. If you care about markets and want them to operate efficiently, you should love Preet Bharara. Mr. Bharara is the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, which is the most important district in our nation. It is here that terrorists most fervently want to attack and have attacked. Mr. Bharara's office defends us against them and has successfully prosecuted many of them. It is here that the mafia and many criminal gangs have major organizations, some of which are then linked to terrorist organizations. Mr. Bharara has been highly innovative in linking those two problems and in attacking them, addressing them, and defending us. This man has guts, and I hope to God he has a very good security detail for him and his family around the clock. And it is here it is here within his jurisdiction that we sit today, and that sits the epicenter of the financial world where many of you will work. Mr. Bharara and his team have done a heroic job of supporting companies that behave ethically by prosecuting those that don't and that try to get an edge from taking the shortcut. He has tackled some of the biggest and toughest cases of financial fraud and insider trading. You've heard of his many victories on behalf of investors and the general public. You've heard of Raj Rajaratnam and the Galleon Group, the Madoff swindle, of course, and his successful efforts to find those who actually profited from the Ponzi scheme and get some recovery to give back to Madoff's principal victims. You've heard of SAC Capital. Mr. Bharara wants Wall Street to thrive. He wants Wall Street firms to improve their cultures to the point where he doesn't have to do any more investigations. Today, he's going to tell you all about what he's learned in his 5 years on the job. And he will tell you how you and your company can create an ethical culture so that you will never have to meet him again. So we are so pleased and honored and grateful that he has taken time from his atrociously busy schedule to come talk to us. Every future class of professional responsibility is going to see the video of today. You guys get to see the real thing. Please welcome Preet Bharara.
Thanks everyone for having me here. Thanks. That was quite an introduction. I now fear for my life. I didn't until you told me that I should. But I hope I'm among friends. I see something. I haven't been in a classroom on your side for a long time, but I see something's never changed. Nobody wants to sit in the front. I didn't actually bring subpoenas, so it's okay if you want to sit there. One quick thing, I'm always astonished when I get invited to speak at business schools, and certainly one as prestigious as this, given that my brother probably in many ways would be a more interesting speaker to people like you in this audience. My brother, just a quick story about my family background. I just have one brother, there are two siblings, and we both went to college, and then we both went to Columbia Law School. And after law school, we both went to large firms in New York to practice law. I went to a smaller firm thereafter to get more experience in the courtroom. My brother did the same thing, and then our paths sort of diverged. My brother decided he wanted to become a business person, didn't have the benefit of a business school education, and maybe that's why his first internet company failed, and why I lost all my money that I invested in his internet company. He then got back up on his feet. I went to the U.S. Attorney's office. Some years later, I got the privilege of being nominated to be the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York by the President and confirmed by the Senate. So in my family, I was doing pretty well. And the sibling rivalry and competition, I thought I was winning. So my brother calls me at some point after I've been the U.S. Attorney for a while, and he says, for a little while, and he says, I just want to let you know, I'm starting a company. I said, what kind of company? He's like, I think we're going to sell diapers. I said, like on the door-to-door? What do you mean? He said, no, I'm going to sell them on the internet. You're familiar with this thing called the internet? And I said, yes, I've heard of it. And he said, so I'm going to do this thing. And I said, well, so you're going to do it on the side because you have you know, you have a nice job, you have health care, you have a 401k. He's like, no, I'm going to quit my job. I'm going to take all the money, all my savings with my best friend from high school with whom he had started the first company in which I lost all my money, and said, and we're going to sell these diapers on the internet. And I said, knock yourself out. And I'm thinking, I'm the U.S. attorney, he's selling diapers on the internet. Fast forward about a year and a half, and some of you may know this, he calls me up one day and he says, I just want to let you know that this morning, Amazon is announcing they're buying our diaper company for $540 million, which was my brother's way of saying, you know, hey, bro, I see your whole U.S. attorney thing, and I raise you $540 million. And I often like to joke that my parents, people often ask, you know, which of the two brothers are your parents most proud of? And they're very smart not to say, but my very proud Indian-American mom, all I know is that it was only after my brother sold his company for more than $500 million that she called up Dr. Sanjay Gupta's mom and said, you can eat your heart out. She didn't actually do that. So part of the point of that story is to just have people understand, one, that my brother is much richer than I am, but two, that contrary to what some people think, and one of the things I want to talk about is busting some myths that people have about me, my office, and prosecutors generally. We are not anti-Wall Street. I think any prosecutor or prosecutor's office that is you know, on some kind of vendetta against a particular industry or a particular kind of business shouldn't be in that office. What we go after are particular crimes committed by particular people, and there may be places where there are pockets of criminality and misconduct and lack of ethics that we focus on more from time to time, but it doesn't mean that everyone who is engaging in those activities and in those financial enterprises is corrupt or a bad person at all. A couple of things by way of background about my office so you get a sense of what we're about in case you ever come across us. If you just read the financial press, you would think that all we do is insider trading cases and, you know, certain other kinds of financial fraud cases. That is not so. At any given time, there are only a handful of people who are engaging in that kind of prosecution and investigation. As was mentioned in the introduction, we have about 220 to 230 assistant U.S. attorneys, mostly criminal, some civil, and on any given day, we are doing mob cases, we are doing gang cases, we are doing gun cases, we are doing arms trafficking cases, we are doing, very importantly, terrorism cases. And all of that stuff is highly important to us, and that you sometimes get a skewed view of what the office is about because there's so many financial press outlets, and you know, there are I believe there are three 24-hour business channels. There's no 24-hour gang channel. But those are among the cases that are most important to us because lives are at stake and kids are being killed in places like Newburgh and the Bronx and other places. And that's really incredibly important work that sometimes I worry gets short shrift because there's so much hype around some of our financial fraud cases. It is true that we care a lot about financial fraud cases for a couple of reasons. One is, as a natural matter, there are two kinds of cases that our office will always be at the forefront of doing, I think. One is terrorism, because as was said in the introduction, New York has always been a target, and ground zero sits in our district in Manhattan. But the other thing that sits in our district is Wall Street. And so we have a particular interest and mission in making sure that people play by the rules and that no one acts and thinks that they're above the law. So we care about those cases also. It's just in recent times, as also was mentioned quickly, we brought two significant cases, one against SAC Capital, in which that hedge fund pled guilty to a number of felonies and agreed to give up, in addition to the money that it gave up to the SEC, $1.2 billion. We then also had a deferred prosecution agreement with respect to JP Morgan Chase in connection with its failure to have good anti-money laundering procedures in place and allowing essentially the Bernie Madoff Ponzi scheme to take place through an account at JP Morgan Chase over the course of decades. And they agreed to pay $1.7 billion. Just to give you some sense of how I think about the business aspect of our job, my annual budget in the office that allows us to do all those cases, the corruption cases, the gang cases, the gun cases, the civil fraud cases, it's about $50 million. And just a handful of assistant U.S. attorneys in our office were able to get those two settlements, which total about $2.9 billion. We don't get that money. In the Madoff case, it'll go directly to victims. And in the other case, it'll go to an asset forfeiture fund held somewhere that I'm not aware of. But were it to come to us, just those two cases alone, in the last 3 months alone, would enable our office to conduct all of its work with respect to public safety and keeping the markets fair and safe, all of that for 58 years. So it's a bit of a better return than most hedge funds you will ever work at. So, so why do I come to a business school like this, and I go to other business schools from time to time? Also, it's not quite what you might think in terms of being a scared straight program. This is what's going to happen to you if you don't obey the law. Although, it's a little bit of that. The way I think about it is my words are not so much directed to, the 2, 3, or 4 of you who, as a statistical matter, are likely to commit serious securities fraud one day, although you know who you are. I think I see a guy right back there. It's always interesting when I say that, and some heads turn to a particular part of the room. I don't know what that's about, but we'll be speaking afterwards. But it's more directed to the vast majority of people at any school, at any institution, at any hedge fund, at any bank, at any institution who are good and honorable and honest and ethical and want to do the right thing and graduate from school absolutely wanting to do the right thing and absolutely believing credibly that they're all about doing the right thing. And if you make some money, there's nothing wrong with that, but they want to do the right and honorable thing. The problem, and I'll get to this a little bit more in a few minutes, the problem is that in case after case that we now have I have personal experience with, that ambition to do the right thing and that ambition to sound an alarm bell or to recognize a red flag doesn't actually bear out all the time. And all these big cases that you read about and you hear about, and they were mentioned in the introduction, whether you're talking about Bernie Madoff, or you're talking about Galleon, or you're talking about SAC Capital, in all of those cases, there were people, good people, honorable people, I believe, who knew that there were bad things going on at those places long before my guys ever showed up with subpoenas and search warrants and arrest warrants. And that is true not just on Wall Street, it's true at universities like Penn State, where we saw terrible conduct that had been overlooked and where people had turned the other way for a period of time, and serious conduct that affected young boys at that school. And to my mind, one of the principal challenges for anybody in any institution, again, whether you go and work at a Wall Street firm or you go and you run a college or you run a U.S. Attorney's office for that matter, is how to make sure that the good people, some people are going to commit crimes no matter what, but how do you make sure that the good people, when they see bad things happening, don't look the other way and stick their head in the sand? Because I know it is difficult. It's a difficult thing to do, and maybe in the questions we'll talk about this a little bit. It's a difficult thing to do, but that's why I think it's important for you to hear what I have to say on this issue. It's because in too many cases, in too many circumstances, people haven't sounded the alarm, and a lot of pain could have been avoided in a lot of places a lot earlier if good people said something when they saw something bad going on. So, what have I seen over the course of the last few years? What you have been reading about in the paper when it comes to financial fraud and Wall Street. We have seen, really terrible and egregious criminal conduct at some of those prominent and powerful publicly traded companies, consulting firms, accounting firms, and even law firms. And, of course, on the part of high-flying money managers on Wall Street. Many of those folks we're talking about are not mid-level people, they're not junior people, although some of them are. We have seen criminal conduct at the very top of the food chain. And the interesting thing to me, and should be interesting to you, is that in that area of criminal prosecution, we're talking about some of the most educated, successful, moneyed, privileged, smart professionals in the country who have put not just their companies, but their own personal liberty at risk to get a little bit more. And they've gone often to the best business schools in the country. I don't have a tally, but there are people who graduate from this school and from Harvard and from Wharton and from Stanford who should know better. They didn't grow up in the way that some folks who we prosecute in our gang work grew up, and that in some ways presents to me a mystery, but also an opportunity, because it's a way to think about why you should behave in a certain kind of way when you leave here, and make sure that the same fate that befell a lot of companies that I've mentioned doesn't befall the place that you go to. Before I talk a little bit more about some of those issues, just to give you a little bit more background about our office and how we think about things, because I think there's a lot of misperception, a lot of myths about how a U.S. Attorney's Office and the Department of Justice operate. So first, our ethic generally. Notwithstanding the breadth of power we have, we exercise discretion. Discretion is really the bread and butter of what a prosecutor does and how he or she thinks about how to bring cases. We're not in the gotcha business. I expect the prosecutors in my office, some of whom are here today, to be open-minded, to be fair, to be supremely principled in how charging decisions are made and how dispositions are handled. At the same time, I expect them to be tireless in discharging the duty that the taxpayers, which includes you, pay them to perform. I believe that we should be We should be absolutely fearless in bringing righteous cases no matter the public outcry, and we should be fearless also in walking away from cases no matter the public outcry in the opposite direction. One of my predecessors would say, you know, in some ways you judge a prosecutor and a prosecutor's office and its integrity not just by the cases that it brings, but by the cases it chooses not to bring. And just because you have a lot of people yelling in a mob that a particular case should be brought, we always have to be guided by the facts and the law and what the interests of justice require, not what people are screaming about who don't necessarily have access to the facts or an appreciation and understanding of the law. We bring scores of white-collar cases every year, and we also end up walking away from cases because to bring them would be against the evidence and against the interests of justice, and that is as it should be. We say all the time in our office, and this is how I was trained when I came in, and this is how we train people now, and this is how I hope and trust we'll be training people for decades and centuries to come, that justice is more important than victory. If we have people in our office who think that their job is to notch victories on their belt as opposed to doing the right thing, we don't want them in our office. And I don't know that people fully appreciate that. Does it always work out that way in every prosecutor's office? Perhaps not, but that is the ethic that we espouse, and that is the ethic that we aspire to. Second, as I already mentioned when I talked about my rich bro, we're not anti-Wall Street, despite the nonsense that you may read in some places. We target crime. We don't target entire industries. We target particular targets who have engaged in bad conduct that we can prove beyond a reasonable doubt to a unanimous jury. We don't issue reports or engage in fishing expeditions. Sometimes financial institutions are our targets, as they should be. But sometimes, and this sometimes gets short shrift, financial institutions are victims. And just in one example, and something that I think any one of you, no matter what you end up doing after you graduate from business school, you're going to be spending a lot more time thinking about the risks posed by the cyber threat. And in the cyber area, the FBI, the Secret Service, and the U.S. Attorney's Office all band together with financial institutions to figure out ways to prevent other, bad guys in other countries, sometimes state actors, from coming in and stealing people's accounts and from affecting infrastructure and trying to turn up, destroy exchanges. And those are cases in which we work together. But sometimes it's the case that there's malfeasance at those institutions, and we have to work on that also. As I have said many times, there is nothing inherently wrong or bad about a hedge fund or about an expert networking firm or about aggressive market research, for that matter. There's nothing at all wrong with any of those things. But if a firm has effectively made criminal activity its business model, then business as usual has to stop. Or the consequences, as dozens of defendants have now discovered through cases brought by my office, the consequences will be severe. And so that's an important thing to remember. Third, which also sometimes people don't follow, we are sensitive to and have an obligation to be sensitive to collateral consequences that may fall upon innocent third parties if we bring certain kinds of cases. We are sensitive to the delicate nature and special circumstances of investigations, in particular, of financial institutions. We have to be. We in our office know, and we talk about it all the time, that sometimes just to commence an investigation against a certain kind of institution is the equivalent of rolling a grenade across the threshold of the company, especially a financial institution. And so we spend a lot of time thinking about the proper way to proceed so we're not doing undue harm while we're discharging our duties. And given the existence of vulnerable shareholders and employees and markets, we have to be sensitive to that, and we educate ourselves about that, and we train people to be sensitive to those things. But that said, the other thing that's very important for us to make sure people understand is that no one is above the law. While we're sensitive to collateral consequences and don't want ever to inflict undue harm during a legitimate investigation, no one should believe that they have immunity from inquiry just because they're a big institution or they're a fragile institution, because no one is above the law. People sometimes like to use the analogy of either me or people in my office as being cops on the beat or sheriffs of Wall Street. In some ways, that's not the best analogy. The way I sometimes think about it is that we're a little bit more like firefighters. When there's smoke, firefighters are supposed to go and investigate and see if there's actually a fire. Often, there is a fire, depending on the nature, quality, and odor of the smoke, but sometimes there's not a fire. And we would be remiss and not be doing our job if we saw and smelled smoke, and didn't go in and investigate. Now, sometimes, firefighters go in and they have to break windows, and there's some collateral damage to the house, but that's in service of their mission to make sure that people are not going to die in the house and that the neighborhood is not going to all burn down. They have to be sensitive to make sure that they're not causing undue collateral damage while they're doing their primary mission of checking to see if there's a raging fire in a building where there are children who might choke to death on smoke. But that's their job, and we would not be doing our job otherwise. One last point about the fragility of institutions. To my mind, it's an important business point. If yours, and you go to one, if yours is an institution that is so fragile that the mere issuance of a subpoena or performance of a court-authorized search warrant might destroy your entire business, then it is incumbent on you in that business to be even more careful and more scrupulous than everyone else. That's common sense and smart business practice. So every once in a while you hear about damage done by legitimate investigations where there's been a lot of smoke and not yet a determination about fire. Those complaints fall a little bit, I must tell you, on deaf ears. Fourth, about our office, we as criminal prosecutors, I'm not speaking about civil regulators and rule makers, but we as criminal prosecutors, we stay in black and white areas, not the gray. And there are a lot of reasons for that. And they all, if you think about it, they're just common sense. One is we don't have unlimited resources, notwithstanding the fact, as I described earlier, that those two cases would be able to fund my office for 58 years. We're in the middle, and hopefully it'll end soon, but we're in the middle of a months-long hiring freeze. So I lose a prosecutor, I can't hire another prosecutor back. And I have two of the great prosecutors in our office, June Kim and Bonnie Jonas here, but I don't have 1,000 of them. I have a limited number of them. And I don't have the time, energy, resources to go on fishing expeditions against big companies because it would be fun and cool to do so. So we don't do that. We go where there's actual smoke, not where we wish there were smoke. Second, good faith in connection with a criminal investigation. Good faith is and always has been a full defense to a criminal prosecution. We have to prove in a criminal case not just that certain actions were taken, but that the reason those actions were taken were because people had criminal intent and what they knew they were doing was wrong. And if people make a mistake, as happens sometimes, it may be a terrible thing, there may be civil liability, but that is not a criminal prosecution if people are just stupid or negligent or make a mistake. So that's an important thing for people to remember about how we think about prosecutions. And related to that, people should have notice. The rules shouldn't change along the way. There was a lot of nonsense written when we first started bringing some of our insider trading cases because people were speculating as to what theories we would be relying on, and they turned out to be, I think, those concerns untrue, because then people started seeing the actual complaints and indictments we brought. They're black and white, bread and butter criminal cases. We only target those and can only succeed in targeting those and convicting those who were doing things that they knew to be bad and wrong. We're not in the habit of prosecuting individuals who in good faith are engaging in business activity. So that's how I think about our office. So the problem, as I was talking about before, is why do people keep doing these bad things and keep getting into trouble? What's the solution to that? And to my mind, as I've been doing this for 4.5 years now, the solution is in many ways less in our hands, although we have a role to play, but more in the hands of people like you. When you go to businesses, you can be a force for making sure that things are done properly and being a force for making sure that the company doesn't go down the tubes. One thing, this is pretty easy, and maybe you're talking about this in your class, figure out what the law is. You don't have to study the law necessarily, but there are people there who are supposed to be answering questions. You have outside counsel. It's actually not that hard to figure out what the law is. And we found in many circumstances, people love to stick their head in the sand and avoid knowing, and they think that's going to somehow save them because they didn't know what the actual law was. But generally speaking, that is a terrible, terrible practice. What also needs to happen at firms, I think, is a renewed focus on basic things like ethics and integrity, going back to first principles. And making money is great. And my brother loves the fact that he started a successful business and is about to start another one. And you should all be parts of institutions that can make money. But it is important for your institutions also to be thinking about doing it in the right way and not breaking the law and not cutting corners when you do it. I found over and over again that there's never any redundancy in repeating and reinforcing the need and importance of integrity in any enterprise. Simple things, in fact, bear repeating. I think we sometimes assume, and I think I'm confident that everyone here is a great and honorable and justice-seeking person, and you sometimes think that everyone must be like you. And you go to an institution, you think, well, I'm a good person. Those people must be good people also. And that time and time again turns out not to be true. institutions need to be reinforcing those things and not just saying it once when you come into the firm. Reinforcement of the basics is absolutely essential. Since I'm at a business school, I thought I would quote from a business professor. A professor named Walter Bennis, who has written many books, and maybe you've seen some of them, for business leaders. And in one he writes this, which has always been compelling to me. He writes, quote, "One thing that has become clearer than ever to me is that integrity is the most important characteristic of a leader, and one that he or she must be prepared to demonstrate again and again. Too many leaders, corporate heads, but church officials and leaders in countless other fields as well, forgot that they were under some scrutiny and that they could be called to account at any time. They forgot that some things being legal doesn't mean it's right." Note, by the way, that Professor Bennis did not say that leaders must be prepared just to talk about integrity again and again. They must be prepared to demonstrate it again and again. Actions, as usual, speak louder than words. And let me just humbly submit that if you ever find yourself at a bank or a hedge fund or a private equity firm or any institution where people are not repeating these basic principles and they give it short shrift or they roll their eyes when people are talking about them, I submit to you there is already something amiss at an institution like that. There is already the seed of trouble. When you interview, I've been astonished in talking to people sometimes at business schools and who have been at business school about whether or not they get questions that seek to figure out in any way whether the applicant cares about ethics or integrity, or whether or not they're asking questions that signal to the applicant that the institution cares about ethics or integrity. There are lots of questions, quantitative questions, and those are terrific. But not to have any questions at all that seek to ferret out folks who might be prepared to stick their heads in the sand when bad things are going on or commit bad acts themselves, that to me is a recipe for disaster. Not just because you want to have good people working there, but based on cases that I have talked about, companies go down the tubes, and good people who go to companies that otherwise have bad reputations, where they're not paying attention to these things, just as a practical self-preservation matter, it is harder for those people to get jobs later. And so I would think about those kinds of things when you think about where you want to go working at a firm. The other sort of general cultural problem, and a lot of these problems are cultural problems, that I have noticed, and that tends to bug people like me, is there are a lot of folks who are trying to game the system in the following way. They're trying to aspire to the absolute bare minimum that ethics requires, or that the law requires, and sometimes even that the criminal law requires, and which I think is a dangerous thing. They're trying to get as close to the line as possible to think that they can maximize whatever they're doing, and when they do that, they're undertaking enormous amounts of risk. And when I've gone to places, other places, because I don't think I've gotten this question here before, and I say, it is a dangerous thing to aspire to the minimum and try to creep up as close to the line as possible. And one time, a person clearly wasn't getting what I was talking about. I was talking about the danger of getting close to the line, and the question I got from somebody was, so Mr. Bharara, you're talking about making sure you don't cross the line, that it's dangerous to wander too close to the line. So my question is, so precisely how far from the line do you recommend that we stay? See, you get it. I answered more politely than I might have by explaining that I disagreed with the premise of the question. You'll inevitably run afoul of rules and regulations and prosecutors if that is your mindset, if that is your approach to your business. Not only that, you're sending a message to every single other person at the firm that it's okay to come close to the line. That can work for a while, but people will invariably miscalculate, and bad things will invariably follow. A single-minded focus on remaining an inch away from the legal line is just asking for trouble, and I've seen it personally, time and time again. It is a dangerous thing to walk the line and to train others to do it. The way I think about it sometimes is analogizing it to somebody who's committed a DUI. It's like a driver who is constantly trying to game just how close to the legal alcohol limit he can come without getting over the limit, without getting a DUI. Now, I guess you can do that. But over time, how long do you think before that driver gets pulled over? How long do you think before that driver blows the legal limit? And how long before that driver really hurts someone, including himself, on the highway? Aspiring to the minimum, it may seem like a good strategy, and you might go to a place where there'll be a smart business person who's 30 years older than you and say, this has always worked. It is idiotic, and you should either help to change the culture of a place like that or go somewhere else. Just like my office must be about more than just obtaining convictions, financial institutions must be interested in more than just making money and maximizing profit in the short term. And that's not an ethical consideration, as I stated there. That is a business consideration. You know, it's not to say, as I think I've made clear repeatedly, financial institutions or otherwise should be maximizing profit for shareholders and investors, but they should understand the risk of how they're choosing to do business. I mean, we put a lot of businesses out of business because people weren't paying attention to these very simple principles. Here's another business school professor, Noel Tichy, I think, in his book, The Cycle of Leadership. He writes this, quote, "Successful leaders add value. No matter what level or what type of organization, the true measure of a leader is whether he or she has made the assets under control more valuable today than they were yesterday. A leader is given stewardship over assets in the form of people, capital, information, and technology. Their job is to make them more valuable and to keep making them more valuable into the future," which makes perfect sense, I assume, to a business audience. But when your future employers embark on questionable practices, what they are doing is they are adding risk to the books. They risk making the assets of the organization worth considerably less, and they're adding a potentially catastrophic liability. And this thinking, focus on integrity, A, because it's important as an initial matter, and B, because it's important to managing risk and understanding long-term profit, not just short-term profit, has to be part of the culture of any place if it's going to thrive for any lengthy period of time. Profound focus on integrity is absolutely important, and it should be the coin of the realm, whether you're making widgets or diapers or trading people's stocks. People have to say, when they hire folks, how important integrity is, and they have to look for it, and they have to screen for it. And then you have to say it often, how important integrity is, and demonstrate it often as well. It does not suffice, I think, for a leader to give a pro forma admonition to behave honestly and then never say it again. It does not suffice to require training sessions in the minutiae of the regulatory structure. It does not suffice to have strong compliance programs that are fly-specced by 100 lawyers. People need to know and feel it in their bones that the bosses will not tolerate lapses in integrity, that they will be disappointed and angry at lapses in integrity, that they will not look the other way just because someone is making them money in the short term. They can't do that. I'm often amazed, and some of you have worked at places, I'm sure, that have very thick compliance manuals, hundreds of pages long. That can be a load of BS if no one actually cares about the fundamental principles of behaving honestly and with integrity. And there are other places that have very thin compliance manuals, and we never arrest anyone there because it's built into the marrow of the place that they have to do things in an honest way so they don't run afoul of the law, and they can be good businesses and have profit-making potential into the long term. And I think whether one runs a U.S. Attorney's office or a giant corporation or an investment bank or a hedge fund or a university, everyone, from the mailroom to the boardroom, needs to understand and feel it in their bones that the bosses actually care about integrity. And they need to understand that their deputies feel that way, and they need to understand that the middle managers feel the same way, and that every supervisor feels the same way. You know, as you know, and as we've discussed, we do a lot of white-collar cases in our office. And notwithstanding the occasional flourishes that I mentioned of the occasional journalist who will say that we are the sheriffs of Wall Street, in many ways, you will be, because business must police itself. And at the end of the day, long before an office like mine commences an investigation or issues a subpoena, people like you will have had innumerable opportunities to prevent the bad thing from happening in the first place. The disturbing truth goes back to the point I was making at the beginning and why I think it's important to spend time here and talk to you about these things. The disturbing truth is that in the shadow of most massive frauds are lurking all manner of enablers, people who are helpful either to the perpetration of the fraud or to its concealment. Part of your job, no matter where you go, I think will be to disable those enablers and ring the alarm bell early by shouting from the hilltops that business catastrophe awaits if attention is not paid and if action is not taken. The enablers, and you'll run into them, and maybe you've met some of these people, and you want to avoid becoming one of them. They're the ones who dutifully attend the training sessions and sign compliance policies while thinking to themselves, you know, these rules are for the birds. These rules are just window dressing. These rules are something to just showcase to prosecutors and regulators one day should the need arise. And I've had many people waving around their training manuals and programs to ill effect in my office. Figure out who those people are when you go to these places. Figure out who they are and rehabilitate them or get rid of them. They are quietly adding risk to your books. They are invisibly enlarging your liabilities. They, in many ways, are ticking time bombs, and you cannot afford to wait until they are sued by the SEC or worse, arrested by the FBI and prosecuted by us. In fairness, sometimes those time bombs are ticking in silence and in secret, but often people know that something is awry. In the big cases that I've mentioned, like Madoff and Galleon and SEC, people knew. People knew that things were going on. There are signs. There are red flags all over the place. Sometimes those red flags are downright crimson. So do not ignore them or allow them to be ignored. Just because that person is a great earner or has a terrific stock picking record or is deemed too valuable to the bottom line. Remember this, no single person is more valuable than the institution itself. And because what we've seen is a familiar pattern repeating itself over and over again, as insiders sometimes fail to stand up or to sound alarms, and thus too often create or tolerate the conditions precedent for corporate corruption. It happens again and again. And tell me, and think to yourself if this doesn't sound familiar. Someone provides the comfort of a professional opinion that nudges up against the edge of legitimacy, or someone aggressively exploits a vagueness in the tax code that pushes the bounds of propriety, or someone creatively manipulates the numbers under an accounting theory that strains the laws of mathematics. It happens every single day. Someone pushes the envelope or looks the other way or just fails to do his or her job as a professional. And time goes by, and eventually the envelope pushing gets more and more aggressive, and it becomes part of the culture, and the controls get less and less strict, and then finally, the bad stuff really hits the fan. The firm collapses, or there are charges, and then the firm collapses. And thousands of Monday morning quarterbacks at the firm, on TV, in Congress, wonder aloud, what the heck happened? But again, long before criminal prosecutors enter the picture, forward-thinking business people, like you, can play a role over time in fighting off the creep of corruption that is keeping prosecutors in my office so busy every day. Unfortunately, with the economic pressure to perform higher than ever, and that we see all the time, the pressure that you're going to be under, and that maybe you have been under in prior jobs, is not going to get any better. It's going to get worse. But with that pressure, and with enforcement resources taxed to their limit, cultures conducive to corruption can develop, sometimes with relative ease. I have seen it time and time again, and we have the convictions to prove it. At the end of the day, in my view, even though it might seem odd for a prosecutor to be coming and talking to aspiring business people, at the end of the day, we're all on the same side. You are in business school presumably because you believe in the market. We believe in the market too. But efficient markets depend on good information and honest dealings. And we all have an interest, I think, before you take up residence in occupations throughout the financial and other industries, but we all have an interest as citizens in making sure that our markets are fair and that no one is held to a lower standard and no one is above the law, and that we all operate with fairness and integrity. And I think if you just think about those things from time to time in your future dealings in business, we'll all be better off. So thanks for hearing me for a few minutes. I'm happy to take some questions.
Thank you so much, Preet. That could not have been better integrated with the things that the students have been learning this week. Thank you. So please come to the microphones. I'm sure you have questions, especially after the breakout discussions yesterday afternoon.
Hi, thank you so much. Is this on?
Yep.
You spoke about that you operate in the black and the white, not the gray area. Could you shed a little bit more light on that and explain, maybe give an example of a time when you struggled with making sure you were in the black and white?
Yeah, I mean, people often ask, about our insider trading cases, and they say, well, you have to be able to. We say we have to be able to prove that you've engaged in not only in certain kind of activity and the circumstances look suspicious, but you have to be able to prove that they had criminal intent. And unlike what a securities regulator or a civil suit needs to be able to prove, which is only their burden of proof is a preponderance of the evidence, not proof beyond a reasonable doubt. They don't have to show criminal intent. We do. And so the kinds of cases that we bring, if you read some of I'll give you a couple of examples. We had a case where, there's a lot of suspicious trading going on, but we ended up having somebody say on tape the benefit of having somebody on tape, while they're talking about engaging in passing back and forth material, non-public information. And he literally said, I'm quoting, so apologize for the mild French, he said, you know what, if this was being recorded, that would really suck. That is a little bit more black and white proof of how that person was thinking about what he or she was doing, as opposed to showing just, odd circumstances. My favorite one, though, is in a case that you may have read about from a couple of years ago, where an individual had been caught for insider trading, and he decided to flip our phrase for, decide to cooperate with the government. He wore a wire, sounds very cool, right? And talked to his friend, and the friend told our cooperating witness, who was wearing the body wire, that in light of a Wall Street Journal article on the front page that had come out on a Friday night, and a Friday evening, I think it was posted on a Friday evening, about massive insider trading investigations done by my office with the FBI, that he was going to take care of things, and he describes, in the way that was picked up by the body wire, yay, that he took his flash drive on which he kept material non-public information, and he smashed it with a pair of pliers into little pieces, and then walked out of his apartment, I think at 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning in Manhattan, and chased various garbage trucks and disposed of the pieces of the flash drive that contained the evidence of the crime into garbage trucks. That's more black and white proof of criminal intent. So that's part of what I mean.
Hello, thank you for coming. My name is John Sarushian. You mentioned earlier that your budget was roughly $50 million a year. I was curious, if they doubled your budget, where are some areas that you think you'd start focusing more on or expand into? And in addition to that, are there any policies?
Do you have the ability to do that?
Maybe.
Okay. Wow.
Additionally,
Happy Valentine's Day.
Additionally, are there any policy changes you'd recommend from Washington, D.C. that may benefit your office or help you serve the public better?
Answering the second question first, I like to stay away from policy. I worked in the Congress as a staffer for 4.5 years, and I had my fill of dealing with Washington policy issues. Although, related to your first question, one policy would be giving prosecutors more resources. I often say that if we had, ours is an office where people like Bonnie and June and others in our office, they're working all day long into the night, often on weekends, and we have a certain obligation to bring cases, particularly in cases that involve violence and protecting the public from shootings and from terrorism. So we don't stop doing those things. What ends up happening when our resources are strapped and we don't have enough time, it takes longer. It takes longer to do these things. And on big deal financial fraud cases where you have, literally, I don't know if any of you have ever been involved in litigation when you have been at a firm, it takes a lot of time, to get the documents together, to understand them, to understand what the transactions are. Sometimes they're in foreign languages because a lot of crime is international and global in scope. And so rather than take 2 years to finish an investigation, if I had more resources, it might take 1. I'll give you a quick practical example about why that's so. We have, I think, the best core of securities prosecutors in the country, and that's been so, I think, for a long time. But I have, 15 or 18 of them. I don't have 100 of them. And what ends up happening is everybody has a docket of great cases that they investigate. And sometimes they make a good case, and sometimes the person exercises his or her constitutional right to go to trial. Trials are a very labor-intensive thing for prosecutors to do. So you have a great prosecutor who has completely steeped in an investigation of Bank A, and there's bad conduct there, and they're conducting the investigation and working on it every day with the FBI all day long. But then their investigation from the other case that they completed the prior month, the guy's going to go to trial. And so 6 months into that, they have to stop working on the investigation so they can prepare for trial and go to trial. I mean, I have 3 great assistant U.S. attorneys right now who have been in the middle of a 5-month trial against some of the cohorts of Bernard Madoff that's going on in federal court right now. Each of those people had investigations on his or her plate that are not going to be done as fast. I mean, we're trying to bring other people on them so that they don't get slowed. But the natural, people can't be in 2 places at once. And when you have people who have to do multiple things, each of those things is going to take longer. So if I could add, people sometimes say, do you have all you need? If I had 50 more people, they would all be working just as hard, because there are lots and lots of things that we look at that don't ultimately result in charges, but they're worth taking a look at, and I don't have enough people to do those things.
Thank you.
Hello. Thank you for your time. I'm not sure if I want to go on the record with this question, especially since this is going to be for many generations
Do you want to take my budget, part of my budget away? Because if so, I want the last guy to come back up.
But we've been reading cases for our preparation for these discussions, and in many cases, even when the outcome is successful, and the person who raised the question was found vindicated and true and right, it has always taken a very significant toll, not on that individual, but also their families and possible future. And maybe in many cases, probably for a case that is successful, there are many that are not. And there's an implied responsibility upon the individuals to fight for the good here that we talk about. But could you make a case for an individual, maybe not on a high level, but a middle manager who has to fight an even tougher fight with maybe lower credibility, et cetera, to not just walk away and go look for a different job, but take on that fight and possibly risk so much of self and the family, et cetera?
Yeah, I think and I referred to this, I think, a little bit during my remarks. You've hit upon a very great difficulty in trying to make sure that bad things don't happen and that bad conduct is uncovered, because it is a really hard thing in any institution, and I've spoken about this at length, in any institution to come forward and take the heat of looking like you're, a tattletale, or you're a traitor. Sometimes people will think of those folks, whether you're talking about someone, whether you're talking about Serpico in the police department, or you're talking about somebody who's inside a tobacco company and trying to let people know that bad things have happened. It's a very hard thing. And because human nature is what it is, there are laws in place to try to, that take into account that they're hard things to do. And there's something called the False Claims Act, and something more recently called Dodd-Frank that you know about, that actually financially incentivize whistleblowers to come forward. And some people, in the public debate think this is not a great thing, but it is a reflection of people's understanding that human nature is such as that they need to have some incentive to come forward, because they could suffer a lot of harm to their own reputation, to their money-making abilities, so that people can get a portion of the fraud judgment. And so in whistleblower cases that we bring all the time, sometimes we join in with whistleblowers who brought cases in federal court, they have a financial incentive to do it, because sometimes it takes a reward for people to be able to come forward. I think that if you go to institutions where they don't have a good policy about whistleblowers, and people who raise a red flag are punished, that's a terrible place to be. And ultimately, that's a place that's going to suffer a lot of consequences. I'll give you one quick example of how we're trying to make sure that people are focused on that problem and highlighting that problem. There's a company, it's a big government contractor called SAIC, and it engaged in a multi-year massive fraud with respect to timekeeping system that it was creating for the city of New York called City Time. And at the end of the day, we ended up prosecuting a number of people who were at the company, and we also prosecuted the company itself. And the company itself ended up paying back every penny of fraud that had been perpetrated against the city of New York. It was $500 million. So it was a nice big check we gave to Mayor Bloomberg. But what was also important there was, in connection with the deferred prosecution agreement, we made them admit and recite that in 2005, when the level of the fraud was only, I think, to the tune of $60 or $70 million, which is a lot, but ultimately rose to $500 million. But in 2005, when it was only $60 or $70 million, there was a whistleblower who came forward and who was ignored, and whose complaints were not very well investigated at all. And had the culture been better, and they admitted that the culture was not good at the time, had it been better, the city would have saved $440 million worth of fraud. So I think everyone has a role in trying to make sure that the issue that you talk about is not as difficult a one going forward.
Hi, thanks so much for coming. I didn't think I'd have the opportunity to ask someone a question because last semester I had someone come from Bitcoin to one of my classes, and I just read recently you had arrested him. And I thought, yeah. So I thought, given professional responsibility, it would be my responsibility to ask you a question about that. And I just had a question specifically about unregulated markets that are new, especially in digital areas like Bitcoin. If they're not used for illicit purposes, what is your role, you think, in sort of providing regulation to them?
God, that's so awkward.
Yeah. Yeah.
Look, we've been very clear on this, and I said when we announced this case, and I said when we announced the seizure, I think we actually have more, with the government entity that has more, value in Bitcoin, I think $30 million or so, in connection with the seizure. We do not seize Bitcoins or virtual currency because they are Bitcoins. We seize them, and in this case, we brought the case, and I'll talk about it in a second, because it was proceeds of illegal activity. In the same way that we, sometimes along with the U.S. Marshal Service, we'll seize cash, we'll seize yachts, we'll seize people's Rolls Royces because they're the product of narcotics trafficking. That's why we seize it. Again, in the same way that I said there's nothing inherently wrong with a hedge fund or an expert networking firm or all sorts of businesses, to my mind, and we've said this, I think, very clearly over and over again, there's nothing inherently wrong with any virtual currency. But you got to play by the rules. And if you're thinking about investing in a virtual currency, or you're thinking about propagating one, you have to make sure you obey all the regulators' rules, just like other people do with respect to cash. And if you're going to break the law and you're going to decide that Bitcoins are a great way to sell crack cocaine on the internet through Silk Road, which is the website that, stay away from Silk Road, guys, okay? Especially a couple of guys in the back. If you're going to use it for that purpose, your Bitcoins are going to be seized in the same way that your cash or your yacht is going to be seized. And that's how we look at it.
All right, thanks.
Hi, thanks for coming. Following up on the earlier question about your budget and how you manage it, can you talk about how you strike a balance between maximizing the deterrent effect that you can have through cases with with justice, with punishment fitting the crime?
Look, deterrence is among the most important things that we care about, right? Because as good as I think the folks in our office are, they are not omniscient, and they can't be everywhere. So we can't prosecute. There's a lot of crime going on right now that we will never find out about, and we can never prosecute, and certainly may not for periods of time. Often we're prosecuting conduct that happened 2, 3, 4, 5 years earlier. So what prosecutors rely on, whether you're talking about gang cases or you're talking about financial fraud cases, is the deterrent effect, the specific deterrent effect against the particular institution you're going after, so that they know they should never do that again, but also the general deterrent effect against other similarly situated individuals or institutions who think, but for the grace of God go I better not do those things, and I better have better practices and policies in place that we really mean. Now, in the white-collar area, which is mostly what we've been talking about today, hope sort of springs eternal, because in my mind, certain kinds of white-collar crime should be more deterrable than others. So I spend a good amount of my time doing this, talking to business students. I talk to hedge fund managers. I talk to traders groups. I talk to CEOs. I'm going to speak to a bunch of big company directors in a little while, because you want people to understand the work you're doing. You want people to understand what's going to happen if they don't pay attention to not just the bottom line, but also their compliance policies. Because at the end of the day, people, even if they're stupid enough to commit crime, who have gone to business school, who have good quantitative and reasoning skills, they understand cost and benefit. And part of our job is to make people who would do bad things, particularly who are smart, who went to the greatest colleges and business schools and have a lot of money and think, is to make the cost of doing the bad thing even higher, so that they might think to themselves, you know what, I'm actually doing pretty well. I have $1 billion. Maybe it's not, and there are people like this. I have $1 billion. That's pretty sweet. Maybe I don't have to break the law and be separated from my liberty for 11 years to get another $50 million. And I think part of the reason people have engaged in that kind of activity, I don't know, because I'm not actually a psychologist or sociologist, but part of the reason maybe people thought they could do those things was there was not the same kind of sustained law enforcement effort. So people thought, I'm bigger than that, they're never going to find out. If you make people understand that the price of doing the thing that they're thinking about doing that's illegal is going to be separation from liberty, nothing has a greater deterrent effect than that. And that's an important part of what we do, because without it, we would only just be doing, cases, piecemeal, and we wouldn't have the effect on industry that I think we want to have.
Morning. Thank you for coming to speak with us, taking the time this morning. When you described the sort of just the fraction of cases or matters that come across your desk that you're able to pursue, it sounded to me sort of like the Supreme Court and the decision to grant cert. And I was wondering if you're able to discuss with us a bit what the consideration set is for you in terms of deciding which of those matters to pursue, beyond just the black and white versus gray issue. Yeah,
generally speaking, the things that come to my desk are not often about whether or not to look into something, the opening of investigations. Usually that's done by, contrary to popular belief, where people think that I have personally targeted particular individuals or institutions. Cases rise from the ground up. You have a cooperating witness who comes in the FBI, or have a whistleblower like we talked about before, or there's an article in the newspaper that suggests there's a particular kind of bad practice going on, there's been a complaint about someone engaging in a Ponzi scheme. Those things happen organically, and if there's, so the smoke alarm goes off, and great professional career prosecutors and agents at the FBI and the DEA or wherever begin to pursue them. And I say, I tend to stay out of people's way. That's one of the best things that I can do, and let really good and smart and dedicated people do their jobs. What ends up coming to my desk at the end of the day is sometimes the decision on whether or not there is enough evidence to actually pull the trigger and to make a charge, or a decision about whether or not any leniency should be granted to an institution. So, for example, in these cases that I discussed, these large resolutions with SAC Capital and JP Morgan Chase and some others that you may have read about and that you will soon read about, those are the kinds of things that come across my desk. And we have, just so also you understand, we have a pretty open policy, particularly when an investigation is overt, meaning we're not investigating someone in secret like a lot of our narcotics investigations are, because there'd be a worry that people would flee. But some of our corporate investigations, there are lawyers on the defense side that are engaged. There are business people at the target company who are engaged, and we invite them in. I mean, I don't know if this is a point that people appreciate. We invite, because we're not crazy people. And we also understand that there's some things that we don't know, because many of us did not go to business school. And we say, look, here's what it looks like. Here's what we see. We see you did this and that and the other, and it looked like lying, cheating, and stealing, and we're going to charge you guys because we think it was terrible. Tell us if we're wrong. And people will come in, and they have very smart lawyers, and they'll try to explain why we have it wrong. And sometimes they're persuasive. Often they're not persuasive. So it's the way it is. And so when things get to my desk, it's usually in the nature of that, of trying to hear whether or not lawyers and business people are being persuasive in their argument that we have it wrong.
Thank you for being here this morning. Could you share some of you talked about the different types of criminals you prosecute. So between organized crime, gang members, and white-collar criminals, are there any similarities you see across those groups?
You reminded me of something that, yes, in some ways, about something that I forgot to say in answer to another question over here about deterrence. So there are differences between a lot of the white-collar criminals and others. And the way I sometimes put it, a little bit indelicately, is this, and why I think that there's an ability to deter well-heeled white-collar criminals in the future, and it's this observation. Generally speaking, I have never heard of a case where an FBI agent or a DEA agent shows up at the doorstep of someone who we believe to be a Latin King or a Blood or a serious hardened La Cosa Nostra family member and gets arrested and asked to put hands in cuffs. It's very rare that those people faint. On the other hand, people who have gone to very nice business schools and are used to having homes that float on water, those people, as has been documented in many media reports, do faint because jail is very scary to them. And so, I didn't fully appreciate that until I had this job, and I saw some of the high-profile people we're arresting who, on a regular basis, need smelling salts after the FBI shows up. So that's a difference, and it's a difference that actually is helpful to us in thinking about the deterrence question. And so knowing that there are people like that who are terrified of going to jail, you want to increase in their thinking the idea that if they do these bad things, they might go to jail, and there's nothing worse. It is not, I don't understand how some people don't appreciate, and these are people who have a lot. It's different from some of the people that we prosecute. I mean, the terrorist cases that we prosecute, that's a completely different kind of thing. Those are people who want to kill all of you, who want our buildings to be destroyed, who fly planes into skyscrapers here, not because they're trying, and die in the process. They're not trying to make any money. They're not corrupt. They're evil people who want to destroy us. They are not deterrable in the same way as the investment banker. So you do take those things into account when you think about deterrence. But the fact that well-heeled white-collar potential criminals are able to be affected in this way is an opportunity for us. And one of the reasons why I do more of this speaking. I think one of the best things that ever happened was there was an article written in the New York Times that was a little bit sympathetic. And someone asked me after one of these business school talks, like, what do you think about that article? Did it make you feel bad? And it was a little bit sympathetic about the courtroom scene where a defendant and his family was there when he was convicted. I think it was I can't remember if it was the conviction or the sentence. And the family is crying because it's a sad thing when anybody goes to jail, whether you're a narcotics trafficker, because there are other innocent people who are affected by that, or you're an insider trader. And someone said to me, well, do you feel bad about that? I said, I feel bad that there's crime. I feel bad that people have to go to jail. I feel bad that people have to be held accountable, but that's the job we do. And I thought that article was great because I thought there are a lot of people, hopefully, who are reading that article thinking, I never want to have a scene where my spouse and children are crying in a courtroom because I didn't think the $10 million I had was enough. And I thought it was okay to cook the books or to engage in insider trading and didn't think about what the consequences of that were, even though I went to a great business school and I am steeped in the idea of understanding and appreciating risk.
Thank you.
Are there any additional questions? Okay. Well, I have one. Have you seen The Wolf of Wall Street?
I have. Can I tell one story about that, since you mentioned it?
Please. I just want your review of it and whether you thought it portrayed the good guys and the bad guys accurately. Say whatever you like.
So I actually had to speak at an event at Cardozo Law School on Wednesday that was a recreation of, there were two panel discussions about the underlying case at Stratton Oakmont, which was the broker where all this bad stuff was going on. And so the nice thing about that was I don't get to see a lot of movies because I have 3 young children. It's hard to get out to see a movie. But I was able to convince my family that I had to go and see The Wolf of Wall Street. And my wife says to me, where are you going? I said, I'm going to go see The Wolf of Wall Street. Well, but what? And I said, I got to see it. She's like, why? I said, it's a homework assignment. She said, what are you talking about? I said, I have to give a speech that follows a discussion of the movie and the stuff underlying the movie. So I go see the movie. So I did. And I just want to, how many of you have seen the movie? Okay, so those of you who've seen it will understand what I'm talking about, and the rest of you, I'm not going to spoil anything. It's not a spoiler alert, but my reaction to the movie may have been different from some other people's reaction to the movie. And that is that, there was a lot about the drugs and the sex, but the most harrowing scene in the movie for me had nothing to do with those things. It had to do with when Jonah Hill, who's one of the brokers at the firm, gets a federal subpoena. Now, I have great respect for federal subpoenas, as you might imagine. And he tries, those of you who saw it, remember the scene, and he tries to rally all the people at the firm, and he holds up the federal subpoena, and he stands up on his desk, and there's a wastepaper basket, and he pulls the wastepaper basket onto the desk, and I'm thinking to myself, what is he going to do to the subpoena? And it was kind of freaking me out a little bit. I didn't want any harm to come to the subpoena. Because I have a professional interest. And and I'm thinking, usually I like to see movies, and some people feel this way about animals. I like to see, at the end of the movie, it says no actual subpoenas were harmed in the making of this film. So I'm thinking maybe it's a dummy subpoena. So he gets up on the thing, and he says, this is what we do with a subpoena, and he puts it in the wastepaper basket, and he unzips his pants, and then he urinates on the subpoena, which caused me to hyperventilate a little bit. And I'm thinking, this is really disrespect for the rule of law, and I don't know if you'll fully appreciate this. I'm the U.S. Attorney in the Southern District of New York. There were and I realized that subpoena had been issued out of the Eastern District of New York, and I calmed down immediately. The more serious observation I have about the movie is, first of all, I thought the movie was great. I'm a big movie fan. I'm a big Scorsese fan, and I think some people have been upset that it sort of glorifies the conduct. That's not how I saw it. I mean, one of my favorite movies of all time is the first 2 Godfathers and Goodfellas. Those things made me want to become a mob prosecutor, not become a mobster. And I think at the end of the day, if you watch that movie, you see, what path that person was led down. The one thing that was absent from it, and I understand artistic choice in making a movie. I'm not sure that people would have seen a movie, I'm not sure it would have been as good if it was made in a different way, but there's very little attention paid to the victims. I mean, in fact, there's none. And Scorsese has talked about that a little bit because there's been a little bit of criticism, and DiCaprio also. And they said that was just not the movie they made. But it turns out that the victims of that crime, in the same way that the victims of Bernie Madoff and of broker-dealers that we've charged also, can't be forgotten. And while we talk about a movie called The Wolf of Wall Street, our job as prosecutors and regulators also have the same job, are to take care of the, I guess you would call them the sheep of Wall Street, the people who are gullible enough to fall for the pitch of a salesman who's very smooth and have hope that a penny stock is going to go up in value when, if they're thinking about it, they know that's never going to happen. I think movies are movies and reality is reality, and the people who criticize the movie, I'm not sure I agree with them, and I didn't have that reaction.
Well, thank you so much. I hope you'll please all join me in thanking Preet. Okay, thank you. So Preet and his team must now fly off to battle evil all over the Southern District. We will continue here. Some of the professors have quite a lot of experience, either as lawyers or as people who've actually worked for firms that were under indictment or that were brought down by fraud by previous prosecutors. And so if those who are going to speak would come up, and we'll continue our discussion. Thank you, Preet. We'll continue our discussion, and basically our discussion is for you to ask questions. I think first, come on up here. Let's bring the chairs up here. First, they'll introduce themselves. I mean, they're your breakout professors, so many of you know them, but some have some experiences that might be relevant and useful here. And so after they introduce them, we'll invite you to ask them questions. Here we are. All right, this is on. Yes. Okay. So, all right, well, we'll just first have them just introduce themselves. Here, we've got 2 microphones here for you guys. Okay, Rachel?
Oh, hi. I'm Professor Cowell, and I'm an attorney by training, and I worked with the U.S. Attorney's Office in the IRS right out of law school, prosecuting tax fraud and bankruptcy fraud. And here I am.
Okay.
They almost started clapping. My name is Mark Brennan. I teach the best breakout section. There they are. Those are my peeps. I spent a lot of time in the hedge fund industry, and I'm actually having really bad flashbacks because we all have our crosses to bear. I was Bernie Madoff's next door neighbor. And we talked yesterday about, during the insider trading thing, wow, the guy was just busted. And some people said, don't you think maybe it was a lifelong thing of committing these crimes? And we all know Madoff was doing bad things for a long time. But the part that never made the paper was my doorman would tell me that on a nightly basis, no exaggeration, nightly basis, 2 Russian prostitutes would show up every single night. So wow. Bad guy, worse than you thought. And I've got more stories that my section will hear about, but that's only because they're the best section. So what were we supposed to be talking about?
That's great.
So I worked in the hedge fund business. I'll bore you with that.
My name's Larry Zicklin, and I'm impressed that Mark could afford to live in a building with Bernie Madoff. I spent my career in Wall Street. I spent it really with 2 firms, Merrill Lynch and Neuberger Berman, and I've had a lot of experiences in this area. We've seen a lot of this going on, and I've tried to share it with my breakout section.
Thanks, Larry. My name is Les Levy, and as people in my breakout section know, my background has been punctuated and bracketed by ethical lapses in firms I've worked for. 30 years on Wall Street, starting on the sell side. My first job, one of the first jobs on Wall Street was with a very promising, growing firm called Drexel Burnham Lambert. In 1986, when I had been there over a year, story crossed the tape that one of our star investment bankers was actually going with suitcases of cash to the Bahamas, trading on insider information in an offshore account. Didn't end there. 1990, Drexel blew up. I went to Merrill Lynch. As Preet talked about earlier, Merrill Lynch had a few problems over the years. And From there, I went to J.P. Morgan, and J.P. Morgan, as all of you have heard and seen, is in the crosshairs of the prosecutor's office and the regulator's office. But bottom line is ethics have massively impacted my career, both on the basis of the people around me and the challenges that have been put in front of me.
Okay, so at this point, if you have questions for any of them, anything, be it left unresolved from the discussions or concrete advice, questions you'd be too embarrassed to ask the U.S. Attorney from the Southern District of New York, for example?
I kind of had a question. A lot of this week we've been talking about consequentialism and deontology and kind of what's going to happen if you kind of break rules and whether or not you should break rules. That's kind of how I see that split up in my mind. And this morning in the talk of deterrence, he spoke about kind of very much a consequentialist point of view. It's if you break these rules, it's going to cost you, blah, 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 blah. But I kind of feel like when people end up breaking rules, they consider that and either are so arrogant that they think I'm never going to get caught, or feel like just the probability versus the cost of that is really outweighing that. Do you guys feel that a consequentialist point of view is really a deterrent when it comes to someone who, we talked about Enron in our group a lot and how the guy thought he was so damn smart, like nothing would ever happen to him. Do you guys feel that really can work as a deterrent for people that this is eventually, that may be liable to do this sort of thing? Or should we focus more on the deontology and say, what is the effect of what we're doing? Is this right or wrong?
Can I take a crack at that? I want to be as practical as I can with you, so let me be very practical. I have a formula that I've used, and I haven't given it to my class yet, but I'll do it now. The formula is R times P equals E. Risk times probability equals exposure. And I would like to persuade all of you in this room that if the risk is high enough, I don't care what the probability is, you can't handle it. A 17-year-old kid that breaks into a gas station and robs the station of $47 and goes to prison can handle it. You can't. So there's no use even thinking twice about it.
Okay. Other questions?
Hello. Our previous speaker said that we should probably include ethical questions in the recruiting process to try to assess, the candidate. And I was wondering if you were to interview someone today, what kind of questions would you ask to gauge him?
I think that's a very good question. And again, coming from a background where ethical lapses resulted in not only the loss of a job of a bad actor, but the entire destruction of a firm, it's become clear to me after 30 years, and I'm probably a slow learner, that finding out the ethical compass or moral compass of a prospective employee is important. And I think there's no easy answers. You can't, if I ask you in an interview, do you feel you're a person of integrity and ethics, what are you going to tell me? Of course you're going to say yes. So I think it's a very hard objective or empirical set of facts that you can actually glean from. I think what the most important, I guess, indication that I've found in terms of people I've been interviewing and hiring over the years is the kind of feedback I get from references, and not the people that they give you, the three names of the references they want you to talk to, but a broader group of people who've interacted with the candidate, both alongside of and doing transactions with that candidate. And that can give you a real important read on those very intangible type issues.
I had the exact same question when he was up here. I was thinking the exact same thing. What would you ask somebody? And I started to think about it. And when we teach this class to Langone students, the final paper is usually tell us about an ethical dilemma you had and how you resolved it. And I think that would actually be a great interview question. And not so much, you're kind of putting the person on the spot, right? So it's not entirely fair, but then again, most interview questions, if you consider it that way, are not fair. But not to hear how the person resolved it, but just their thought process and their sentiment. And if it's kind of like, it was pennies, who cares, right? Red flag. If it was, it was pennies and I couldn't sleep for 3 weeks, that's the person you want to hire. And since you brought up reference letters and we're talking about my co-op building, I'm on the board and I'm kind of the gadfly of the board. And these letters and references and what someone thinks of you, the only letters we get from people when they're looking to buy a co-op are from their best friends. So every time they come in, people on the board say, oh my gosh, look at this letter wow. And I say, they're complete garbage. The best reference letter we could get, since he's going to be our neighbor, would be, let's get 3 letters from the guy's 3 worst enemies. That way we know our total downside. How bad is this guy? If we can live with that, we're fine. Everything else is a complete lie and nonsense. And, it'd be like getting a letter from your mother. Just useless.
Thank you.
You have an insane amount of, or an incredible experience in the financial industry. And I was wondering if you had to forecast the state of the financial industry in 5 years, or approximately 5 years, what would you say? And leading on from that question, if you were sitting in these seats, do you think it's justified that so many of us still want to go into the financial industry?
I would think the financial industry will continue to be an important cog in the economy. It's not going to stop. It's the grease that makes the economy work. So it's going to go on forever. In terms of the financial industry, I think it's better than it's been years and years ago. I know there's more financial scandal. I know we've read more about it. I know there's been enormous embarrassments. One of the differences is 20, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, when I was in the industry 40 years ago, everything was hidden. It was secret. It was going on. Nobody knew about it. Now, in the world you live in, there are no secrets. Everything's exposed, or almost everything is exposed, because you have all the methodology of exposure. Technology contributes to exposure. So we're now seeing things we didn't see before. But that doesn't mean they didn't go on before. They were just much more secretive. I think the industry is far better off today in terms of its integrity and its ethics than it was 40 years ago.
So I spent my entire career in the financial services industry, and not just that, I was an analyst and a portfolio manager just of financial services industry stocks. So I was working in the industry and investing in the industry, and things got a little bit out of control. It was probably around 2004, where 46% of the earnings from the S&P came from financial services, not the financial services, just the financial services industry, but financial services operations. So manufacturing companies that would have a finance arm were adding that into the earnings. So things got out of control, but it's shrunk down to something smaller than that. It's a big chunk of the economy. It's intellectually stimulating. It appeals to people in this room. Granted, you're self-selected, but it's always going to be there. The opportunity, I always tell people, why go to law school? Because you're going to sit there and you're a taxi driver. You click the meter and you bill $300 an hour, and that's that. I love law too, but you go to the financial services industry, and you can, reasonably use leverage, and therefore you're clicking 5 meters, and you make that much more money. So I know this is an ethics class. I come from that world. You could have people work for you and have their own meters, but I just, there's leverage. Leverage is good and bad.
Well, let me answer that question from the perspective of this unique platform, which is, we heard the U.S. Attorney Preet talking today about his attitude. Looking back, in my case, 30 years, when I first came to Wall Street in the 1980s, and to Larry's point, that a lot of the stuff that you read in the headlines today was always going on. It just wasn't, it wasn't focused on. But what probably strikes me as one of the most interesting things, and when you look forward, I think you're asking what things are going to look like in 5 years. I think the man speaking here before might be a strong indication of where some things are going. Because in 1980, the whole nature of Wall Street changed when a very aggressive prosecutor in the very same seat, using the platform to some say to his self-promotion, was able to crack down on insider trading in a way that had never been done before. So Rudy Giuliani obviously went on to a bigger, more national platform. But bottom line, that seat in the New York prosecutor's office, really came to redefine, what was going on Wall Street, and and firms and individuals lived and died. In the 90s, same thing. You had a very aggressive, ambitious prosecutor. His name was Elliot Spitzer. He basically went after one area of Wall Street, which was sell-side research. As a sell-side research analyst, back in 1995, 96, I could sit down with the CEO of a company or the CFO of a company, and that person could tell me exactly where the earnings were going before they reported in the following quarter. Or I'd be able to sit down with two of my big institutional clients and the CFO of the company, and they tell us where earnings were going and what some of the obstacles the company was facing. Bottom line, when Spitzer cracked down on that kind of research and targeted analysts like Jack Grubman and Henry Blodgett, the rules changed. Reg FD has completely changed the environment for Wall Street research analysts, for corporate, public corporate officers, and the interaction with the street. So a lot of the change that one sees, or at least I've seen in my career, has really been driven in some ways by the seat that Preet is sitting in today, which is why this kind of session is really important.
I just want to add one thing, if I may. I want to tell you the best thing about Wall Street, because a lot of negative things have been written. And I've been in it, as I say, almost 50 years. The best thing about Wall Street is I never had a dull day. There was never a day that I didn't wake up eager to read the newspapers, seeing what was going on, and having a trigger in my mind that I've got to think about this, I've got to think about that, I want to do this, or I don't want to do that, or I want to sell, or I want to buy, or I want to further investigate. Never a dull day. I don't know how many other industries can say that.
Thank you.
Just curious to get you guys' thoughts on the difference between sort of intention of sort of a criminal act as well as sort of naive, maybe ignorance. So, imagine you're driving down in a car down the street and your taillight's out, and you may get arrested for that, or you may get in trouble for that. Can you talk about the consequences of maybe not knowing that you're getting into trouble, or you're just a passenger, reputational damage? What comes with that?
Well, that's really simple. Ignorance of the law is no excuse. So you're presumed, wherever you go, you're presumed to have knowledge of the law. So you can't say, if you're told to do something and you don't know it's illegal and it turns out that it's illegal, it's basically too bad, because our legal system judges us by our actions, by our outward actions, by what we do, not by what we're thinking about inside our head. So it's sort of the opposite of psychology. So that would be, you would still be responsible, you'd still be liable.
I have questions. Sorry. When we talk about professional responsibility, we talk about ethics quite a bit. And it seems that through our discussions that the ethical decision, especially in what some call an age of moral relativism, is very difficult to have. It's very abstract, and you don't necessarily have to make ethical decisions unless you're not quite sure whether something is in white or black when you operate in a gray area. But what we've talked about today and in cases is when there is an outright clear violation of a rule or a law and what we should do about it. There's no determination that we have to make whether that is an ethical choice or not. And it seems to me that in many cases, if you don't know whether something is ethical or not, you could learn it out, you can find the answer. Usually people do not act in a gray area, but they have to act in a black area. So are we suggesting that really what we need to be worried about is having the courage or understanding what the black is, and then having the courage and having the assets and resources
to act upon it, to do something about it?
I think Preet Bharara kind of spoke to that issue when he talked about the fact that these cases that he prosecutes, by and large, had antecedents beforehand. There were red flags or yellow flags or some kind of flag out there. And we see that all the time. These train wrecks that we read about in the paper, they happen in slow motion. They didn't happen at one moment in time. There were all kinds of events that took place before the train wreck. The switch was tossed, somebody was speeding, somebody else was not paying attention. It's all kinds of events. It's up to good managers, of whom many of you will be good managers, to anticipate these events, to have, as I told my class the other night, to have the hair on the back of your neck go up when some of these clues are becoming obvious to you. And you have to be sensitive to them, because otherwise you're going to evolve into a train wreck. So you've got to see it.
I echo your sentiment on the destruction posed by moral relativism. I told my class yesterday about an example, and I told the faculty this morning, when I used to follow the banks, they would have conferences, and you go to a presentation, and each of the banks would rent a hotel room, and you go up and meet with them in the hotel room. And I went to a conference one time at the Palace Hotel on Madison Avenue in like 50th Street, and I was walking home from the meeting, and an analyst from SAC came running up to me on the sidewalk, and he had something under his arm, and he was all excited. And this is way past the statute of limitations, so it's not an issue. He was all excited because under his arm was the binder from the investor relations guy at Wells Fargo that he had, stolen from the hotel room, filled with, tons of non-public information, and he was excited to get home and start rifling through it. And it wasn't just that incident, but it was many incidents that I would always walk around saying, and people thought I was crazy, SAC is one day going to end in tears. And it ended in tears.
Yeah.
Crocodile tears for most of us, but probably real tears up in Greenwich.
That is a clear violation, though, correct? Yeah. There's no doubt about that one.
One thing I'd observe is that the corporate culture of the firm you work for is hugely important. And as you look at financial services companies today, the corporate culture has, in many of the big firms, has inherited this enormous amount of compliance, regulatory type infrastructure, which, if nothing else, is making it more and more clear to individual employees what's black and white. By contrast, in 1985, walking around the high yield desk at Drexel, I could talk to a banker, I could walk to the trader, the banker could walk to the trader, and talk freely about what was going on. There were no, the corporate compliance officer, most people didn't know who he was. If you wanted to do a trade, you only came to him after you did the trade and ultimately had to report it. Things picked up after the 80s because of what happened there. But today, I think any smart corporation in this industry, because it's both highly regulated and highly monitored, has a lot of, certainly bells and whistles and a tremendous amount of compliance infrastructure that should make it easier to stay on the other side of the line.
Well, my message for this course is that there's tons of gray areas, and there's usually not a clear answer to most situations that you will encounter. But I think that most of you will realize when something doesn't seem right, and you'll sort of feel it in your gut. And I really like Preet's advice to not go too close to the line, because if you get close to the line, you may step over the line. So they go after cases that are black and white, but a lot of those cases first begin as gray cases. So what might not seem wrong in the beginning eventually will become black and white, and you really have to watch out for yourselves. The company is not your friend. Remember that. You need your own attorney. And not me. But really, you really need to watch your back out there.
And by the way, as an aside, just to follow up on what Rachel said, sometimes it's not you moving over the line. Sometimes the line moves. And what you did, what you did before that was considered completely ethical becomes unethical. Well, think of the tobacco companies. How many years did the tobacco companies do all the things they were doing? And one day, the world changed. And they wanted to continue doing what they were doing, but it was too late. They were over the line, and they had to make a $1 zillion settlement, and they're still paying it off.
Okay, no further questions. For the moment, at least.
Thank you. We've been hearing time and time again throughout these past few days that one of the best things we can do for ourselves is to surround ourselves with a great team of people who we believe have a high moral character, that we believe have integrity. And I feel that, you know, straight out of business school, we might not all be in the position to just choose our teams. We might not be able to be the managers that we want to be, in the sense that we might not have that managerial role. We may be placed on a really large team. And there's certainly whistleblowing that can be done, but there's also preventative measures that you can take, and being agents that we are of the company and also our own agents. What could you offer any guidance for us who, if we do see something in our own colleagues that we are not managers of, that we can take action in preventing any sort of unethical behavior?
Let me tell you something I heard at one of our faculty meetings. Somebody help me if I get this wrong. But at one of our luncheons, somebody said, first let me tell you what my student said to me. One day, I was teaching a class like this, and a student said to me, Professor Zicklin, I hope one day to be rich enough to be able to do what you're suggesting. And that student understood the difficulties of life. But what I heard at this luncheon was one of our faculty members mentioned that the way to do it might be to say, let me understand what you want me to do, or is this what we're supposed to be doing? To be completely naive, as if you don't quite get it, and to simply raise the issue in that naive way. So somebody in front of you has got to say, well, yes, I really would like you to fudge those numbers. Or I'd like you to channel Phil in some area that we probably shouldn't be. You're not going to hear that. So that's a way to do it. And if they don't get hints like that, I think Preet's right. You better find a different place.
Thank you.
There are corrupt institutions out there. I'm not saying they're not. Don't work there.
Now, I think that some of you had stories. I mean, you've already shared some stories, but did some of you have stories that you were thinking of sharing to illustrate some of the issues about law that we've been talking about?
Well, let me give you one of several stories that, actual experience I had. As a sell-side analyst, I was very closely identified with this multi-billion-dollar communications company that it was an emerging communications company, satellites. And I was working then at JP Morgan, the underwriter. We were responsible for underwriting more than $8 billion of securities on the company. The company was emerging technology, so there were risks. It was not an untroubled launch. The bottom line is the existing CEO had to effectively step down, and there was a lot of ambiguity around where the company stood. And I had a large constituency of institutional investors and salesmen within the firm and others coming to me asking, where do we go? Where's this thing going? What do you think? By accident, and this is again pre-FD, pre-Spitzer crackdown, a banker said to me, I want you to meet the new stand-in CEO. Nice guy, he's from Australia, see what he says. I went into a conference room, and within 20 minutes, it became very clear to me, and he made it very explicit that this was a company that was, one, in the absolute imminent need of a restructuring, two, that filing bankruptcy was probably going to happen sooner rather than later, and three, vast amounts of its debt and security value is going to be wiped out. And then he said goodbye, and he said, call me if you want to talk further. Now, bottom line was, I walked out of that room and I said to myself, well, this is a very troublesome situation. On the one hand, I've got a fiduciary obligation to clients to provide them with information, research information. On the other hand, I'm now privy to material non-public information, which, since Reg FD wasn't in place, they weren't going to go out and file an AK to tell the marketplace about that. What do I do? And without giving you the answer to the question, think about it. I think, bottom line, the rules and regulations are a lot more rigid today. In terms, a banker would never put a research analyst in a room with a CEO like that, certainly unsupervised. And that kind of information wouldn't be put forward by a CEO, particularly one that was somewhat cavalier. But bottom line is, I had to go back to the trading desk, sit down, and continue to get pummeled by questions on where this company was going. The end of the day, full disclosure, I walked briskly to the compliance office. I said, "This is what I know today. Please restrict me in the name so I don't have to talk about it to anybody." And sure enough, that was done. The very fact that I was restricted and that came out, the entire capital structure just plunged in the marketplace with the view that, hey, J.P. Morgan's restricted, something's going on. But there's no playbook on how to handle situations like that, and it was not certainly the last of the kinds of things I would have expected to encounter in terms of meet and greet with a CEO.
I guess I was in the wrong part of Wall Street. I just remember sitting in a cubicle staring at a computer for 15 years. But when I was 16 years old, I was arrested buying beer. And yeah, it's out. So this will be my last
Your
day here at
lecture's canceled.
And I knew all the rules, and me and my friends were dragged into the police station, and I knew not to talk, and I had seen all the TV shows. But when I got to the police station, the reality of what had happened to me suddenly dawned on me, and I was worried sick. Luckily for me, my parents were so sick and tired of this is pre-cell phone time, were so sick and tired of my friends calling constantly on the phone that they actually installed a phone in my bedroom. So I was so concerned with what my father was going to do that my parents would never answer that line, except my mother, who always kind of wanted to know who was calling. So it's like 10:30 at night, my parents are both asleep, so I called my line, knowing that my father, no chance he would answer it because I know he would explode. My mother goes in and answers it, comes down to bail me out. Actually, when you're 16 years old and you get caught buying beer, they don't bail you out, they just come down to pick you up and take you home. So my mother walks in, and all I cared about was, I said, "What did Dad say?" She said, "I went back into the bedroom and told him, and he burst out laughing." So that was not the right message to send. But a couple months later, when we went to juvenile court, and it was one of the most infantilizing experiences of my family's life, they held it in a nursery school, and the chairs were this big, and we literally had to sit in chairs that big. And the question from the court was, "What did your parents do?" And I said, as we were walking to the place, my father said, "If you ever drag me into a place like this again, I will kill you." And so when we got in there, I said, "My father is very upset with me." And they said, "Okay, that's good." And I think most people in this room come from that background, and the likelihood of you doing something crazy is not going to happen. And your background and your culture is more, this message has been reinforced again and again and again. I kept buying beer illegally until the age of 21, but, and probably so did everybody in this room. But my point is just, we are all part of the crooked timber of humanity. This room, you didn't get into this room because you were walking up to the edge constantly and then ended up in NYU. Unlike the SAC analyst who forged his transcript and then got into Stanford after being booted out of Harvard. The people in this room are quality people, and I'm proud to be associated with them.
I would just add one, too, if I may. I became ultimately managing partner of our firm, and when you're a managing partner, one of the problems you always worry about is failure to supervise. Because you can do all the good things, But if there's something that goes on in the firm, and it can be demonstrated that you should have known about it, you can be in very deep trouble. So I was always worried about failure to supervise. And one of the things we did, because I knew there were 1,200 people working there, I couldn't keep track of 1,200 people, neither could anybody else. So we tried to establish a really good culture at the firm. We worked very hard at it. And every quarter, I made it a policy to meet all the new employees. And I'd have breakfast with the new employees, and I would talk about what the firm did, what its ambitions were, what the scope of the business was, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But then I would always say something like, and the one thing we worry about is that something could go wrong because our business was based on trust, pure trust. And I said, if we did something to violate that trust, the assets would disappear and we'd be out of business. And I would say 1,200 people work here, which means 1,200 families earn their living here. And we're all responsible. So there are two things, was part of the message I would give them. One, you can't do anything that would evaporate that trust, erase that trust. And number two, if you see somebody else doing it, you've got to tell somebody, because we may not know. You have to assume that we want to do the right thing, so you've got to tell us. I retired in 1999, and in the ensuing years, I've met many of those people at social events, walking in Central Park, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And whenever I talk to people like that, they always say to me, I remember the first time we met at breakfast, I don't remember a thing you said, except for the fact that I was responsible for the livelihood of 1,200 families. I never forgot that.
Wow. Well, I think we could not ask for a better note on which to end today's discussion. I hope these stories complement Preet's. You can make it the business case, you can make it the moral case, but it all points the same way. In the long run, take the high road. We'll break early. It's been a long session. We've got a boxed lunch waiting for you, and we'll reconvene this afternoon. Thank you.